James Harpur, thanks very much for joining me on Hermitix podcast.
Well, it's very nice to be here, James, and thank you for inviting me.
We're going to be discussing your recently published book, Dazzling Darkness, The Lives and Afterlives of the Christian Mystics, which is a near sort of encyclopedic volume detailing the lives and afterlives of Christian mystics, all the way from figures such as Pseudo-Dionysius through to Desjardins and Thomas Merton and everything in between. And there is, for those that consider themselves to be familiar with figures such as those mentioned, or Eckhart, or whoever it might be, to my surprise, there was many in here that I hadn't come across. So this really is an extremely thorough volume, many overlooked figures in here. We won't have time to touch on them all, nowhere near enough time. And one of the questions I had is just how long, introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself, but just how long did this book take you, and what was its origin?
Well, I'm to introduce myself. I'm not sure what level of detail that you'd like, James, but I grew up near London. My father was Irish. My mum grew up in Paris, and they both met in London before the war. And I grew up in a suburb of London. And I've always been interested in spirituality. My father comes from a long line of Church of Ireland ministers, and my mum was interested in more esoteric spirituality, by which I mean, I suppose, spiritual healing, seances, and automatic writing, that sort of thing. So I grew up from a very early age with taking for granted the existence of the invisibles, and I've never really got out of that habit, to be honest with you. At school, I studied divinity for A level because I thought it was more important to get a handle on God than anything else. And at university, I changed from classics to English literature, but I fell into a very deep Jungian phase, which I suppose fed into my interest in spirituality. And it was at university I decided to try poetry as a way, actually, of getting to become more involved with spirituality. I was under the impression that poetry could lead me there, because all the great poets I thought of were all spiritually inclined, from Homer to Dante to Milton to T.S. Eliot and Ted Hughes. And so that's basically what I've been doing since university days, a long time ago, writing poetry and investigating spirituality. And the actual cause for me writing about mystics came after a very profound experience I had back in 1981, when I was in a state of quite low depression and physical disability involving my back. And I was having to lie on my bed for long periods of time at my mother's house. And without really knowing it, I began to meditate and pray. And I was reading various spiritual texts to hand, like The Imitation of Christ by Thomas Kempis, and Four Quartets by T.S. Eliot, and the Bhagavad Gita. And after a while of meditating, and I must stress I didn't know I was meditating, because I think that was part of what happened next. I became more and more calm and serene, and more gaining a perspective on my travails. And this continued in frequency and intensity until one morning I fell through a trapdoor of light, as it felt. I felt my whole body filled with light, and almost like a liquid. It was so visceral and powerful. And at the same time, I could feel my consciousness, or my ego, obliterating, and a fantastic feeling of being at one with the universe and being filled with love. And I couldn't actually feel my body physically. It was like I was a sort of a glowing entity of light. And to the extent that there was just a tiny part of my ego left, and it panicked. I actually had the thought that I was going to die. Or if not die, I would go mad, or I'd be so radically changed from who I was that I wouldn't know myself. And it was just that moment of panic that drew me out of this moment of ecstasy. And when I came out of it, I was kind of changed. I felt extraordinary compassion for the people around me, and for strangers and for the world around me. And it lasted for at least 6 or more months. It wasn't just a sort of flash in the pan. And I thought, well, since I've done it once, I could always return to this state of ecstasy. So I began to meditate consciously, with a view to getting back to that moment of ecstasy. And I've never been able to do it, because there's a sort of a psychic law that says if you put your mind to becoming of reaching a place of ecstasy, you won't happen because you put your mind to it. Mm-hmm. And I think the reason I managed to fall into this trapdoor of light was because I didn't realize I was doing it. It really was an ambush. And after that, I was just fascinated by what had happened to me, and I wanted to know if others had experienced the same, or how they had. I'm sure they had. I knew I wasn't, unique in this. So I just began to read mystics of all sorts, Christian mystics. And eventually, just to satisfy my own curiosity, I began to write this book a long time after the event, and to do it chronologically to see if there was any development or progression, and also to put the mystics in the context of their times, to see whether that made a difference. And also whether there were more mystics in some countries than others. I was just curious. So the book was a product of curiosity. I'm not a professional theologian or a professional academic. So it's a book written really for those like myself who are just curious about the whole mystical process, and curious to know what other mystics went through and how they reported it. So I think that's probably my best introduction to me and the book.
Would you consider that moment the most important thing that's happened to you?
Yeah, I would actually. I was before that moment, I was kind of a very, very regular middle class lad. I mean, my interests, and I continue to be interested, were West Ham United Football Club, playing tennis, going to rock concerts, following progressive rock groups like Yes and Genesis and Jethro Tull, the Groundhogs in particular, going to parties, trying to find a girlfriend and keep one if I found one, smoking and drinking. And that was my I suppose my habitual life up to this point. Although as I mentioned, I did have these sort of spiritual interests and longings from an early age, which were always lurking underneath the surface of the teenage hedonism. So it did change me radically. I've never been the same since. Although I reverted to the aforesaid West Ham United.
But did you stop listening to Jethro Tull? Did God gave you better taste in music?
Well, I can't say. I mean, I actually I've had a revival of all my since YouTube. YouTube is faithful to one's youth. You revive it on a daily basis. But It's not that I rejected everything. It's just that I had a huge new perspective on things. And I think the biggest thing was that, I was reasonably selfish, self-centered, um, insensitive, and I still am. But I was radically less so after this ecstatic moment. And at least for the past 6 months, I astonished myself by feeling huge compassion, maybe on public transport. If I saw someone sort of, I don't know, laboring because of a noisy child on her knee, I just feel this huge, great sort of strange tenderness and sympathy. It was, it was very, very weird. And so that's why I wanted to pursue it and see what others had had and how they wrote about it.
Is that how you sort of form some definition of a mystic or mysticism? Then is there an ecstatic, invisible experience that overhauls someone in some sense that they couldn't consciously do?
I think that's the core idea about what a mystic is. I think that's the common perception. I suspect that you're bumbling along, and then you have this out of body or hyper intense experience of something beyond yourself, which you might call God, or depending on your religious disposition in the first place. I mean, I think St. Paul, or Saul as he was then, he was going off to Damascus to arrest Christians, to persecute them. And suddenly, out of the blue, he falls to the ground at this blinding light, and a voice says, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? I mean, he could not have predicted that. And so I suppose that's part of it. But when you start delving into the lives and the teachings of the mystics and commentators, it becomes more complex. To give two examples, scholars tend to draw a distinction between visionaries and mystics. For example, Hildegard of Bingen, who saw these wonderful images, and William Blake, who also saw sort of wonderful concrete images like the ghost of a flea, were clearly visionaries, but some scholars debate as to whether they were mystics as well. Because I suppose you can have a vision, but it may not be related to what an Orthodox Christian might term as God or the divine presence. In other words, if I were to turn around and see the ghost of a flea, as Blake would, does that make me a mystic? Though, there's a great body of Blake's other visions that would suggest that he was. So it's kind of quibbling in a way, but that's one of the distinctions. Another one, let me see, would be that there are cases of people who are reckoned to be mystics, but they don't actually claim to have had a mystical experience per se. And famously, Meister Eckhart, I think you can infer that he probably did have something mystical going on. Otherwise, the authority that he generates in his words wouldn't be as it is. But he didn't actually sort of write a letter saying, dear Henry, I had I had this amazing experience in the way that I've just done. And another one is Walter Hilton, the English mystic of the 14th century. He's one of the 4 or 5 great English mystics at that time. And he wrote an influential book, but he doesn't say, this came out of my extraordinary ecstasy. So those are two of the issues that scholars debate. And I suppose the other thing I would want to say is that the word mystic, to describe someone of that nature, the word wasn't used until the later Middle Ages. Before then, mystics were called contemplatives because the monastic tradition made a difference between those who meditated or meditation and those who contemplated. Meditation is really object focused. You meditated on a text, a biblical text, and you sort of let your imagination tease out the implications, or on a holy icon. So it was quite visual, whereas the contemplative was more what we would think of as a mystic, of trying to enter a discursive, a non-verbal realm, and trying to find a connection with the great beyond.
I wonder then, I mean, I'm sort of channeling Pseudo-Dionysius with this idea. I wonder if we could go some way in saying that a mystic is a vessel with relative levels of transparency. So mystic is someone who, is a channeler, and not just a sort of a, and I don't mean this in a crass way, but not just a regurgitator of dogma or theology, but actually a channeler in that Pseudo-Dionysian sense of the light is coming down. And I guess in that sense, it brings us to the other question of whether or not Christ was a mystic, because then is Christ the whole light itself, quite literally? Yeah, there's a lot there, but I wonder, because it seems in the way you actually describe your own experience, not that I want to say that you're a mystic, it's interesting that something seems to remain. There was some experience that then, was channeled that allowed a different experiential understanding of the world.
Yeah, I wouldn't call myself a mystic. That's for me, that's a huge claim, and I'm too, I don't want to get into myself on this, but I'm too attached to West Ham United, and to put it in a nutshell, in a way that I don't think St. John of the Cross or even T.S. Eliot would be. But I think from what you've just said, I think the core component of experiencing something beyond your ego, yourself, is pretty fundamental to the mystical writers I include in the book. I include about over 70, but I would say there are countless others. But you can only, I mean, the great historian of mysticism, Bernard McGinn, pointed out is that you can only talk about mystics on the basis of what they've written, because anyone can come up to you and say, well, I've had this mystical experience. But really, the body of mystical of the mystical tradition is based on writings of what the mystics said about their experiences and how it influenced their way of writing about God and the Christian tradition. So really, you're writing about their writings as much as anything else. But in most cases, their writings are based on some sort of core, existential moment of ecstasy, or ecstasies, or visions, or voices, and so on.
Well, not to be coy, it's interesting you mentioned St. John of the Cross, speaking as a poet, which is the literary form closest to mysticism in that sense. Because as you say, we, in only being able to deal with their writings, it seems that poetry would be the one which would be the form which is the closest to the true experience.
Well, I have a horrible bias on this, because that's all I write about, really. But I disguise my my mystical inclinations under different personae. So I wrote a long poem from the point of view of Simeon Stylites, who has lived on top of a column for 30 years, or a series of columns, the last one being 60 feet high. And he wasn't quite a mystic, but not far off it. His idea was to sort of get away from the earth, literally, and to seek solitude. But it all backfired. He became such a cause célèbre that he attracted hundreds and hundreds of people who crowded around his column, shouting out their prayers to him. So I've written. So my poems tend to pick the characters who have sort of mystical personalities and channel my own mystical feelings through them. John of the Cross was a wonderful mystical poet, and of course William Blake was too. And I think you're right that the language of mysticism, especially when mystics are describing their own particular experiences, does become more impressionistic in a way that prose can flatten. And especially with the scholastic mystics, like Richard of St. Victor, St. Bonaventure, they kind of take the mystery out of mysticism through their very, very scholastic and complex and quite prosaic presentations of their mystical systems. Unlike some of the, as I say, well, William Blake, for example, would be an obvious example, but also the English, or rather Welsh mystical poets of the 17th century, like Henry Vaughan and George Herbert and Thomas Traherne, who convey their sense of joy and at oneness with the divine presence, in poetry. And T.S. Eliot too, of course, in his four quartets, does the same.
Mm-hmm. So, just jumping back to, I mean, it was a question that jumped out on me, and it's one you address in the book that no one really thinks about, because it's not something you want to charge Jesus Christ with, which is whether or not he is a mystic. There is, of course, a alternative history that some people would like to use, whether Jesus being an Essene, or Jesus is, the forgotten, empty, the years we know nothing about, and often people putting quite lazy projections of what they think happened. But
yeah,
understanding Christ and his ministry and his miracle working actually as mysticism isn't something we often explicitly address. We don't think of him as a mystic, we just think of him as Christ.
yes, I think he's sort of too big for all categories, really. When I consider the idea that he might not be a mystic, I was sort of shocked, because it's kind of the first thing I think about Jesus, that he was in tune with God. But in Christian, theology, he is God. It's not that, he's fully divine and fully human. So for him to be a mystic would be like cheating. Because he is God, at least in one way. But I think he's different from the common conception of a mystic, of being someone who's in a monastic cell, engaged in contemplation, and then perhaps writing about it. Jesus was so engaged with everyday life. I mean, he wasn't a monk. He went to wedding parties. He went to taverns and mingled with tax gatherers and prostitutes and so on. There is that aspect that the Gospels mention on the slide, that he used to go off to the mountain to pray. And I suppose that could be a clue as to his way of tuning into the great divine. But it was not as if he came back from the mountain and suddenly said to the disciples, guess what's happened to me? I've just had this amazing. But I think he's just, as I say, beyond all categories. That you wouldn't want to say he's a, you could say he's a preacher, which would be true, but he's much more than that. He was a miracle worker, but more than that. He was sort of everything, really. But definitely you could say, at the very least, he had a very profound mystical connection with God. I think that's the very least you could say.
Do you see the mystical tradition beginning with Christ, or do you see it beginning?
I think the Christian tradition has to start somewhere, and it wouldn't have happened without Jesus. The tradition that we're most familiar with probably started. Well, it probably started from the word go. I mean, the number of mystics we don't know about simply because they didn't leave their writings. It's probably huge, but St. Paul definitely had a mystical side to him. For example, his vision of Jesus on the road to Damascus. But the first, I suppose, concerted movement of Christian mystics and mysticism probably began after Constantine the Great became Roman emperor. And you probably know the story that before the great battle with his rival Maxentius in 312, he saw a vision of the cross in the skies. And he won the battle, and he attributed his victory to the cross in the sky, which he connected with the Christian religion. So he made the Christianity the most favored religion in the empire. So clergy were excused taxes. The funds were available to build churches, and suddenly overnight, what was quite a lowly and possibly despised religion became top dog. The Christians suddenly had status and influence, so not so much power perhaps, but certainly influence. And that, was a game changer, really. It meant that in order to kind of show your Christian credentials, which you did ultimately by not being disloyal to your faith despite the threat of death, going to the Roman arena, that no longer happened. That was known as red martyrdom. So what you could do instead was choose white martyrdom, as it was called, which meant sort of dying to the world and going off to the desert and finding a nice little cave or building a little shelter and communing with God and dying to your attachments, to your family and to your possessions and so on. So it was sort of like a mass ascetic movement. And unsurprisingly, you get, individuals who seem to have had quite profound mystical experiences, like St. Anthony of the Desert, who had visions of being tempted by the devil, who appeared as a seductive woman one day and as a wild animal another day. And Pachomius, who began to form these isolated hermits into communities. And really, they were just trying to get back to apostolic poverty. They remembered the fishermen in the Gospels, and they could see the great disjunct between that life and the new life under Constantine the Great, where Christians were becoming wealthy. So I think that was the start of the Christian mystical tradition. It was born in the deserts of Egypt and Syria.
It seems then that even throughout the entirety of its history, it has a direct relation to some metaphorical desert, some place where one can, who is a mystic, one can retreat to, that is that which will bring about an atmosphere that will, shed away wealth, will bring about poverty. Even so, from the Desert Fathers all the way through to Thomas Merton being a Trappist, we see this correlation with tucking yourself away as much as you can to get away from the world. Did you notice any anomalies throughout this history of people who perhaps did the inverse? I mean, I guess for me, Francis of Assisi perhaps comes to mind. But were there any other sort of striking other examples of a mystic whose mystical inclination actually threw them into the world?
Yes. Well, I think you're right that there is the sense of desert, of emptiness, and the idea of breaking your attachment with the world, and of dying to yourself. And I do think that's fundamental. And the question is whether you can do that but remain part of the world and partake in the world in the way that Jesus did, in fact. I think you can. I mean, I think there are a lot of mystics who didn't, because they were part of the monastic tradition, which didn't lend itself to, going off to taverns in the evening. You had to tuck up early at 9 o'clock with your glass of milk and your holy book, ready for a bright and early start at 2 o'clock in the morning for a round of prayers. But I think in the classic mystical journey, or a test of the true mystic, is whether he or she can transfer their mystical experiences into compassion and love, which naturally will find its way into the world. And you're right about St. Francis of Assisi. He seemed to be very world orientated. It's clear he had very profound mystical experiences, including the stigmata. But he was famous for for embracing lepers and for sending out his followers to help others. I always love the saying attributed to him, which is him talking to his followers and saying, "Preach the gospel, and if you really have to, use words." It was a kind of a mission of doing and not saying. And there were other mystics who went out into the world. I'm thinking of Catherine of Genoa, who led a fairly conformist life until she had a mystical experience, and afterwards she founded a hospital in Genoa, and would help the sick and the poor and the dying. She was out there mixing it. She was like a sort of Teresa of Calcutta in that respect. And even St. John of the Cross and Teresa of Avila, famous for their sort of introspection and their profound mystical experiences. They were filled with energy and reforming zeal. They were mixing it with high up authorities to change radically the Carmelite order, which they thought was going to pot. And they formed their own order, the Discalced Carmelites. So although it was within the monastic sphere, it wasn't as if they were holed up, just contemplating God. And I think that is the test of the true mystical experience, that it kind of fills you with this exuberance and energy, which is founded on love, but has very positive aspects of society.
And they seem then to direct that toward the truth, toward trying to articulate the truth, whatever that might be. Especially in the case there of St. Teresa of the change from the Carmelites to the Discalced Carmelites, there is, strange as it might seem to say, a use for this mystical experience, for this feeling.
Yes, I think so. I think in some of the texts they say that not only do you feel this sense of oneness with the world, but you receive a sense of guidance, which I think is a very comforting idea, because, well, I've kind of lost my way rather, but the idea that you're called to do something particular to your talents and to your limitations within the context of your historical epoch, I think is a very profound idea. I.e., it's the idea of vocation and fate, really, isn't it? And it's the opposite of the sort of atheist, nihilist view that we're kind of conglomerations of atoms blundering around, bumping into each other and making the best of it, which is a coherent worldview up to a point. But certainly I've never had that sense of blind chance and randomness, particularly through having synchronistic moments. And I've had one or two very, very striking ones, which don't prove the existence of God, but they kind of shake one's belief, if one had it, that things are random. You've probably had synchronicity yourself, James. I can see you nodding.
Yeah. Well, not just synchronicity, but moments of that. I mean, I've sort of thought that you're at the mercy of language, aren't you? So it's but moments of that, of the sort that you talk about with at the start of your own experience, not exactly like that, but moments of deep compassion that just can't fall back to reason or rationalization, and any attempt to do so would sort of be in a strange retrospect where you'd sort of feel like you were betraying it. Same with synchronicities. Yeah, I'm sort of struggling to talk about them because I just think, and perhaps this is almost like the curse of mystics and mysticism, is, I don't know, in a way, and it's not a question I had down to ask, but in what sense is the experience being betrayed? Because we spoke earlier about poetry as the form that is closest to this experience. In a certain sense, I think poetry is because it's the closest to silence.
Yes.
And not in that, not in the famous Beckettian way where he says every word is a stain on silence, like it's almost a positive silence, the apophatic silence.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, there's a question there: is the only way to not betray mysticism is because there has been some truth found that the mystic themselves feels, and this is the case, to go back to Meister Eckhart, is something I always mention when Meister Eckhart comes up, is, as you said, there's nothing in his writing that shows that there was some mystical experience, but equally, this is a man taking gargantuan risks with his sermons. And so there must be within him a felt sense that the truth that he has found, when he's saying, oh, everyone needs their great sin, to his sermons, and saying we need to move this from Latin so that everyone can understand it.
Yeah.
Whatever that risk is, there must be a truth that he truly feels needs to be given.
Yeah.
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 And that's his
Yeah.
way of not betraying it, I guess.
Yes. When you mentioned the Beckett quote, I think of there's a quote attributed to Jalaluddin Rumi, but I can't find the source for it, but it goes along the lines of, the language of God is silence, everything else is mere translation. And I feel that, that every poem I write is a kind of admission of failure. Which is basically the apophatic way, which you mentioned, and I don't know if all your listeners, know that term. It's sort of quite technical, but it's basically, the idea that nothing can be predicated or predicated of God. You can't say anything about God because he's beyond all categories and words. So that if you have to talk about him, you have to talk about God in negative terms, like calling him the abyss or the desert or the emptiness and so on. And that's really, I suppose, how I feel about it a lot of the time. I'm in a sort of, as a poet, I'm in a double bind really. And I've written about this on a number of occasions, that all my impulses, any sort of possible gift I have is towards writing and evoking scenes and taking care over the sound of words and phrases and the rhythm and the half rhymes. And the other half of me says, well, this is, you should just, instead of putting words on a page, you should leave them blank. That would be a more honest way of dealing with ultimate experience. So I'm trying to write as many poems as I can before final union with the Godhead.
But then you would be being dishonest about some felt inclination to write if you stopped. There would be, like Cormac McCarthy says, you have to be insane to write a novel. There's absolutely no reason to do any of this stuff. To sit down and write a poem, write a novel, whatever it is. And so whatever that felt force or inclination to, for some reason, put words on a page that maybe no one will read. That, well, actually did that. Well, even if I mean, sometimes things need to be written and then just destroyed, but it has to get out. I don't think it's maybe spiritually healthy to keep it in.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I used to think that, James, because obviously it's in my interest to think that. But I'm very influenced by the well, not the teachings, but the words of J. Krishnamurti. I don't know if you've come across J. Krishnamurti. He's not quite so well known now as he was, back in the 70s. And he sounds like an Indian guru, but he wasn't. But he was someone who clearly reached some sort of enlightenment. And I think in a lot of his works, he says, why do we write poems and paint paintings? Why write a poem about a tree? Why can't we just be with the tree and sort of be at one with the tree? As soon as you start writing about a tree, you're mobilizing your whole ego consciousness, all your imaginative potentialities. And in doing so, his point is that you kind of lose your connection with the tree. You're creating a dualism. Whereas if you just be with the tree or whatever the thing is, then you're in communion with it in a beautiful way. And I think that is a trap that artists fall into. Again, I can't remember if it's Krishnamurti, but I think it probably is him actually. The idea that people will flock to the Tate Gallery to see a David Hockney exhibition on trees, and they won't actually see the trees on the embankment. The live living things with their leaves, glittering in the sunset. They won't look at those. They'll look at the copy of the copy. Be platonic about it.
Well, that's interesting because in one sense is because people go to an art gallery, like I can't remember who said this, but someone said no one sees Andy Warhol's soup cans. They just say they've seen them. So you go to say, oh, I went and saw them, but no one really mentions anything. Same with the Hockney. You go to say, I went to the Hockney thing. I'll be the one to say that about everyone. I'm painting in broad strokes. But so what's happening there? Same with the poetry, and same with, I guess, any form of creation, is that worrisome tightrope walk of to what extent am I creating or putting this out in the world, not purely just allowing the creativity to flow and commune with whatever, but because I want to seem smart, or I want to appear wise, or I want to say, look how in tune with beauty I am. So it's on one side is that dangerous ego, and on the other side is, I mean, paradoxically nothing. Like nothing speaking. It's sort of from a pure place of love. You just want to say, I wish you'd seen this tree.
Yeah.
And I guess I think maybe that's the same with the mystics, is that, I mean, it's a pure place of love to just say, well, I just wish you, yeah. It's a complete frustrating paradox of sort of almost, well, I think the paradox is almost like trying to forcibly describe the flavor of a delicious meal to someone. But, you're never going to succeed, are you?
I suppose you're not, are you? So why would you do it? You do it well, apart from the negative reasons of wanting to gloat, but you'd want it to express a worldview, or to say to someone, look, it's worth doing. It's worth taking trouble over cooking, I suppose. And I suppose the mystics, such as they had that sort of motive in mind, they wanted people to, I suppose, join the sort of spiritual path, because they experienced this moment of ecstasy where the world changed for them, or they changed for the world. They want others to, it'll make the world a better place. I have to say that after my experience, my compulsion to be aggressive had disappeared. And when I say aggressive, I mean in a kind of low-level competitive way. I wasn't going around kicking old ladies. That wasn't my thing. But we're all more competitive and maybe more brusque or more than we think we are. And it may be that the mystics felt that that it was really worth the candle to experience the divine, because of the change of behavior.
It's interesting that we've sort of got caught up in the apophatic tradition and what we were just talking about there, the impossibility of all this, and not everyone is. I mean, this sort of apophatic theology has not overtaken, but it's become, I think, if we are going to go with the medieval distinction, as you mentioned earlier, between meditation and then contemplation being mysticism, apophatic theology is sort of almost synonymous with the contemplative tradition in a certain sense. And so, the idea of a petitionary mysticism and a mysticism of addition or adding something is rather strange. But is that, I mean, again, the CC maybe with acts of charity, but is there a mysticism of addition?
Well, I think you could argue a case for nature mysticism. I have William Wordsworth in my book, and I nearly put in Richard Jefferies, who was another nature mystic. And some of the poets I have were, like Thomas Traherne has a magnificent passage on looking at a cornfield. And I think that's the closest probably I have found of a mystic sort of getting a mystical experience, or rising to the level of the divine through the world rather than rejecting it. And I think it is possible. And I think the world is divided into apophatic and cataphatic personalities, or people have both strains in them. And I think, I did an exercise where I sort of divided, doesn't matter what the discipline is, so you get Plato and Aristotle, you get Beckett and James Joyce, you get Mondrian and Van Gogh, you get John Cage and Tchaikovsky, you get Leeds United and Manchester United in the 1970s. And I think it's a psychological disposition. I'm convinced of that. And I think people can have both streams in them. I know I do. I can veer from quite puritanical attitudes of wanting to strip away things and being minimalist, say in decor, but then rejoicing in abundance, fertility, color, light, laughter. And I'm sort of, you stuck down the middle, really, which is probably why I write,
Yeah.
to resolve that contrary.
Well, I think the middle, I'm not sure there's a middle as so much as when the pendulum stops, something dissipates and they get folded into one. Because it's interesting you mentioned the Rumi quote earlier, because one sprung to mind, which is that someone said, in their sort of meditative sense, people are trying to be the mindful idea of you're trying to be calm and let things flow through you. And someone said to Rumi, well, I always get so distracted and frustrated and annoyed when I walk down a noisy, bustling street. And Rumi says, well, just imagine that you are the noise and how great that would be. Right. So suddenly you sort of invert the frustration, which would be on the apophatic, which is the cataphatic. And I think it sort of folds into one in a moment of
Yes.
what only could be love, right? You just have to love it. I mean, it's very difficult in London. I don't go there. It's a lot easier to stay in peaceful Norfolk. But I'm not sure if I could get to the point where, in the middle of central London, you could love that hustle and bustle.
Well, it's a very good point, that. And Krishnamurti says something similar to Rumi, which is, if you've got a noise, your instinct is to curse and try to get rid of it or go away. And if you can't, then you're stuck. And I think Krishnamurti's idea is that you observe your resistance. And if you do that, you find yourself, once your cursing voice disappears, evaporates, then it's just you and noise. And a bit like your Rumi thing, you kind of become it. So there's no, because you merge two things, you and noise, into one thing, which is you noise, one entity, and there's nothing to kick against. And that happened to me actually not so long ago. I had builders in, and he was kind of drilling through a wall, and I couldn't go. I was waiting for a phone call. I think I had to stay in. I was thinking, oh my God. Anyway, I tried it out, and finally, it was as if I couldn't hear it. It was weird. So what you say is something I completely agree with. I wouldn't want to do it every day.
I mean, well, there's something. I mean, it's sort of becoming fairly abstract, but there's something there. I mean, I think about all of this, and I think of, to give a few examples, Teresa of Avila having extraordinary long dry. She was very open about the fact her spiritual experience was extremely dry. So John of the Cross being kept in this extremely tiny room and only having this small window. Thomas Merton, I think, before his entry into the Trappist monastery, sitting and getting the flu in the extreme cold, and then wearing, the hair shirts and all this. So, I don't want to draw you into that group, but a very small experience with the drill or whatever it might be. All of this comes from a place of pain or minor hell. And honestly, it seems the only place to find Christ is hell. The only place to find anything like mysticism is hell. No, I don't want to equate a drill with hell.
Yeah,
in miniature, I think it is, though, because resistance is hell, I think.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting way of putting it. So what you're saying is that in order to reach the light or the divine love, there's the sine qua non is to experience the darkness and privation and the purgation, the suffering. I think you're probably right. I'm riffling through my 70 mystics to try to find one.
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting. A mystic who just had a nice life. I mean, is that?
You'd think that was possible, wouldn't you? I mean, I think the human condition militates against it. I think being born, I'm going to quote a recent poem, which is, "We're born in the scream, live in the sadness, and die in the regret." I think the human condition is such that you can't avoid suffering. But I know what you mean. I mean, there are levels of sunnier lives. I mean, I'm thinking George Herbert, possibly, who, it wasn't as if he was locked up in a cell like St. John of the Cross or had a huge dark night of the soul, but he seemed to be genuinely drawn to God and the divine sphere and celebrated it in his poems and hymns. But who knows what suffering he went through.
Mm.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question, James. And I think almost every mystic I can think of has been through the mill, one way or another, either inflicted from the outside or more likely from the inside.
You could tell yourself you avoided suffering, though. You could have walked away from the drill if you didn't need to stay in.
Yeah.
Metaphorically speaking, a lot of, I always dunk on the modern world, but I'm fine with doing so. It does seem that we don't want that. We think any engagement with suffering is going to be to our detriment, which seems logical, but it isn't really. We do avoid. Everyone could be a mystic if they just accepted the drill or the baby crying on the bus or whatever it might be.
Yeah. Well, yeah. I had the dentist drill this morning actually, and I was trying to be mystical trying to be to accept the drill.
Yeah.
I think it helped, but yeah, you're right. I think we try to avoid suffering, and we think it's bad for us. And I think some suffering is bad for us. I went to a boarding school, and I didn't suffer that much, really, not at all. But there is a new form of, there's the latest branch of psychotherapy, which is known as boarding school syndrome, which, not many people know about it unless you went to a boarding school. And it's on the basis that there was quite a large degree of suffering at boarding schools, especially, for young people from the age of 5 to 12. And I think there is evidence that the suffering at that age has caused difficulties and unhappiness in later age. But I think apart from that, certainly, there's the old adage: if it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger. And I think it's the attitude you bring to suffering, isn't it? Really. You can either let suffering warp you, make you bitter, or if you can rise above it or integrate it, absorb it, you can grow, you can become wiser. I mean, famously, people who were abused or suffered terrible things in life, can become healers, and help others because they know what it's like to go through that sort of thing.
Do you think it's possible without going through it?
What, to reach God, or to have a mystical experience?
To have an understanding of that, a deep understanding of that side of things, do you think suffering is a requirement?
Indispensable to. No, I don't actually. Although I can't think of an example off the top of my head. I think through prayer and meditation or contemplation, I think you can reach a degree of perspective and serenity that goes beyond ego control. And I think from there you can, if you're lucky, to use Krishnamurti's image, all you have to do is to leave the window open, and if you wait, the breeze might come. I think you can do that. It's not guaranteed, but I think it would be too perverse to have a sort of chemical equation that you have to suffer in order to reach some sort of divine state of being. Having said that, it seems to be the case that almost every mystic I've come across has had that. And it may be you need that suffering to strip yourself away from your attachments to the world, to put them in perspective. You know how it is if you've had a serious illness and you come out of it, you think, oh, why was I worrying about my car insurance? Why was I worrying about my chimney pot, crumbling? You get a completely different perspective. And it's probably that's what, propels you towards a divine way of being. The fact that suffering strips away in a quite swift way your attachments and addictions to worldly things.
We have terrible memories, though. That's the issue. So we dwell in that for a little while, and then we forget. Because you mentioned the dentist drill. For me, I know rationally that the waiting room is worse than the drill. By far, it will ruin my whole week beforehand. And so there's some sense that the ego side of things wants that suffering to be its own thing, where you can't settle in it. And you can't just settle in the pain and the thing you have to deal with. The ego wants to take it somewhere and make it, excuses and justifications and this kind of thing. Whereas the other side is submission. I think this is maybe another sort of apophatic element that we're struggling with. Is a big part of this is you can't talk about it because there isn't control. So, submission, exhaustion, fatigue, letting go. You mentioned an open window. So much of this is to do with, there you go, take the wheel without sounding too coy. Yeah. Which you can't, you can't, as you said, you can't consciously will, you can't consciously will submission. I'm repeating this.
No, you can't. It's a self-defeating process. It's one of the crudest paradoxes that if you say to yourself, right, I'm going to meditate, you've lost it already, because your determination or your will to meditate is counter to the actual, what you're hoping to happen, which is the loss of self and ego. So you have to pretend you're not meditating. But then you get involved in a sort of retrogressive game. And I think why I was so lucky, or sometimes I think of it as a curse, when I had the experience I had, was that I didn't think I was meditating. I was too young and ignorant. I was just an ordinary fella. And it just crept up on me. And if I thought, oh gosh, I'm meditating, this is great, no, it would never have happened. I'm sure of it. So how you go back to that state of consciousness which isn't trying to will something to happen, and it's a very simple equation. You have a wonderful experience, say, and you want it to happen again. So your ego says, okay, let's go for it. What do we have to do? Okay, we need silence. We need a quiet room. We need some spiritual texts, and off we go. And it just doesn't work. So in the end, you kind of give up. That's the idea. This is, I'm being a bit Krishnamurti here. You give up. And then what happens? Well, he says, find out. And I haven't quite reached the stage of giving up, but I probably will.
I wonder, because a big element of your, one element of your book is obviously it's chronological, so there's the historical context as an element, but also the national element, and often and also the gendered element, so grouping mystics into these groups and looking at these contexts. And of course there's the question of, does mysticism, which seems to be a transcendent value, if you want to put it that way, it seems, or a universal Neoplatonic sort of idea, that it would seem strange if it had differences in national context. But do you think that that notion of one suffering, but also of giving up, is that which cuts across all contexts? People all over the world and throughout history have always been giving up.
Yeah, I think it does go across. You raise an interesting question about, whether, if I read you right, whether it matters whether you are French or German or English or living in the time of the Crusades or Vietnam War. Am I right?
Yeah, whether or not there was any, it would seem strange if you said, well, French 14th century mysticism all had this vision, as if God, well, it would be a strange quantification. As if God said, right, in the 14th century, this is what they're all going to see in this location. Doesn't seem make any sense.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I was thinking about that, and there, the image of fire comes up in a mystical sense of people feeling a strange heat within them, and there was Blaise Pascal in the 17th century, the French philosopher. He had this extraordinary ecstatic moment where he wrote down on a piece of parchment the words fire, joy, peace, forgetfulness of the world, everything except for God, joy, 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 tears of joy. It was like an ecstatic outpouring, and he sewed it into his coat. And it was only discovered after he died, this memorial, as it's known of. And it struck me that it was very similar to the English mystic Richard Rolle, who was 14th century, way before Pascal, who writes about being filled with a strange and intoxicating heat. And then there's also a Greek Orthodox mystic called Simeon the New Theologian, who again says, I'm inflamed. I'm like straw being inflamed by fire. And so I think in terms of describing the mystical ecstasy, the language is very similar. I was thinking that, if you printed out those three witness statements and juggle them around, you wouldn't know, who said what and when. But I think historical context and geographical context and personal context does influence the way that mystics express themselves, and also, I suppose, the way their lives, apart from mysticism, were led, and in turn actually did have an effect on mysticism, their mysticism. And I'm thinking of Teilhard de Chardin, who lived at a time when, Darwin's theory of evolution was very much the flavor of the month. So he evolved his own idea of spiritual evolution, which I don't think would have happened if he'd lived 50 or 80 years previously. But he had this idea of, as well as there being a biosphere, there was also a noosphere. Noos coming from the Greek nous, or noos meaning mind. So, and he had this idea that that the noosphere was like a sort of an envelope of thought around the world, and so people have now called him the sort of patron saint of the internet. It's like the cloud, and that within the noosphere there are these lines of light that converge in what he called the omega point, which he identified with Christ. And it was quite a very bold and daring piece of speculation that he engaged in, so much so that he was more or less ostracized by the church. He was a Jesuit, and he was his writings were censored, and he was sent off to China, which was the sort of the naughty step. And but I think he was the child of his time, really. and I think Evelyn Underhill, the great historian of mysticism, says we can't pluck the mystics out of their historical context. They are part, the human beings. And to take another one, Marguerite Porete, whom I'm keen on, and she was burnt at the stake in, I think it was 1307, for something which now she would be, she'd be on a Eckhart Tolle style of author. She'd be sending books in their millions probably. And all she said was, well, I simplify, but she said basically that if you replace your will with God's will, which is what we all want to do, there's a sense in which you can't sin, because if God is acting through you, or Christ, how can God sin? You can't really. And you can debate that, but there's a logic to it. But of course, the church at the time felt that if people followed her advice, then no one would go to church because there wouldn't be anything to confess. So they gave her a warning. They said, look, shut up. We don't like what you're saying. But she couldn't help herself. And finally, she was banged up in jail and accused of being a pseudo-mulia, a false woman. It's a strange charge, really. And then she was burnt at the stake, which was a tragic end to a very brave woman.
Do you think that would have happened if that message had been written by a man?
I don't know. I've asked myself that. I mean, it's not that the men weren't getting burnt too. The Templars and the Cathars were getting a good pasting, and it was the standard punishment for a heretic. So I dare say, I mean, this is slightly beside the point, but I'm in my latest book of poems. I reference someone called Claude Le Petit, who was a 17th century French poet during Louis XIV. And he wrote a scurrilous poem about the Virgin Mary, doubting her maidenness, to put it bluntly. And his poem was on his bureau table, and the window was open, and the wind caught it, and it floated out, landed on the cobbled street just as a priest was passing, who picked it up and read it, and his face went white with horror. He knew who had written it, because Claude Le Petit was known for being scurrilous. So he was arrested, and so they cut out his tongue as a way of, warning poets to keep their mouths shut. And then they cut off his right hand so he couldn't write. And then they strangled him, and then they burned him. This is kind of late 17th century. And when I read this, I found it absolutely chilling. So that's a slight parenthesis, but it just shows you how times change. And so Marguerite Porete may not have been burnt just because she was a woman. I think they were quite trigger happy with their swan vesta and their twigs, at certain times in history.
Did you notice much any distinct difference between male and female mysticism in your research?
I think there is. I think, unfortunately, the opportunities for women to partake in the religious life was severely limited. It was very difficult if you were spiritually inclined as a woman to partake, because you couldn't become a priest, so that was out. You couldn't become an Anglican vicar, as you can now. You could join a convent, but there weren't that many. There were the Carmelite convents, and there were the poor Clares, who were adjunct to the Franciscan movement. The only other way was to become a beguine, which was the Beguines were sort of women who had a religious instinct but didn't want to join an order. So they were lay people, but they lived in communities, mostly in Belgium and Holland, as was. And they engaged in prayer, contemplation, embroidering, and doing good works. And there are some notable Beguines who wrote very interesting holy texts and poems, but they were eventually suppressed by the church. It just weren't easy about their status. They were neither fish nor fowl. They weren't quite, religious, and they weren't quite lay. So there aren't that many women mystics compared with the men. So it's hard to generalize. Certainly the ones that there are as profound and as in their writings. I mean, Marguerite Perret, her writings are wonderful, and Hildegard is a extraordinary woman, extraordinary person. She was a mystic. She was a poet. She composed songs. She painted. She was a herbalist. She wrote, angry letters to the great and the good of her time. And she was a real Renaissance, Middle Ages woman. So I think there's a revival. I think because there are more and more women theologians who naturally take an interest in women mystics. There's a great revival, I think, at the moment.
So throughout our conversation, it seems almost that, and it would make sense if there wasn't. It seems there isn't really a progression to mysticism. There hasn't been this teleology. It's sort of a recurrence of the light time and time again in new contexts. And I guess with that in mind, like after all this time, I guess since your experience in the 80s all the way through to now, what is it you want people to take from the book?
I kind of, as I said, I kind of did it for myself, just to explore the whole terrain. And I think, as I say in my preface, that what I would like people to take from the book is that they'd be sufficiently interested in the whole range of mystics, that they'd be drawn to actually read the writings of the mystics that they fancy. And it's never been more easy to read mystics. The Penguin paperbacks publish a whole range from Julian of Norwich to Richard Rolle to Walter Hilton, Marjorie Kemp, another wonderful woman mystic, Meister Eckhart, because you get a real flavor from their writings. And I think, as I did, you get a real sense that the world is much more than birth, copulation, death, to quote T.S. Eliot. There really is something much more profound and enlightening and enriching and worth exploring. Otherwise, we can just sink into our sobers, and the advertising industry now have this debating point over what's called double screening, and they've done research that whenever anyone's watching television, 85% of people are also watching their laptop or their phone at the same time. So the idea is to get advertising that can be double screen worthy. And this kind of vision of what Eliot calls distraction from distraction by distraction, is kind of hellish in a way. And we're all I'm prone to it as well. I'm a YouTube addict. And I think the mystics that my book sketches out and tries to give a flavor of gives you a whole different perspective of a whole different way of life. And I hope it would inspire people, if only for the reading of the book for that period, just to get a different perspective on the world and on their lives.
Well, I guess contemplation is the opposite of distraction.
Yes. Yeah.
Is there anything else you'd like to add about the book? Obviously, there's a lot more we could touch upon. Is there anything you'd like to add in?
No, not really, James. I mean, no, just to thank you for. I've really enjoyed our conversation and the way it's led into different paths. And I didn't think I'd be talking about Christianity or art or poetry so much, but they all come into the book in some way. So yeah, I'm not going to flog the book.
I'll be sure to put the links for
Right.
Hurst, and big thank you to Hurst for sending me a review copy, and for you have your own website as well, don't you? So I'll be sure to put the 2 links for those in the description for there.
Okay, that's great. Well, thank you, James. You've been a most courteous and genial host, and you're doing great stuff with your podcast. I have to say, you're raising consciousness, and in your way. Maybe that's do you feel that's your vocation?
I'll finish recording, so I'll just say thank you, and then we can discuss that afterwards. So thank you very much, James.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much, James.